Hi everyone, I'm Hannah with the Artmobile. Welcome back to our 4th virtual art class. Today we are going to be using watercolor paints to create an abstract painting, something like this. The supplies that you'll need for today's class include a piece of heavy watercolor paper, a set of watercolors, you'll need a paintbrush, a Sharpie marker, and a pencil. You'll also need a cup for water, a napkin or paper towel to dry your brush on. You'll need a set of crayons, or at least just one crayon, and then you'll need some table salt if you have it. So go ahead and gather those supplies and we'll get started. So even though we have used watercolors in a previous project, today we're going to explore and really experiment with all the different things that watercolors are good for. So basically, watercolor paint is a translucent art medium. It's a colored pigment in a water-soluble binder. So the paint dissolves when you add water, which means that it's really easy to spread and mix with just a paintbrush and some water, and it's also very easy to clean up. One of the things that I want to take a look at before we start today is the color wheel. We have our warm colors, which are typically the colors of fire, so red, oranges, and yellows. We also have cool colors, so blues, greens, and purples, which are more of the colors of water. There's also a few different color schemes to note. Complementary colors are colors that are opposite on the color wheel. So for example, red and green, purple and yellow, and blue and orange. When you mix complementary colors together, they usually end up looking very muddy and brown or gray. But when you just pair them side by side without mixing, they complement each other. So they make the other color look really bright and vibrant. For today's class, we're going to focus on using analogous colors, which are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So that would be, for example, like blues and greens, or pinks, red, and orange. And these colors, if they mix together, they're not going to turn muddy, they're going to blend really well together. So because we're using watercolors and we're going to blend some colors, we're going to choose an analogous color scheme to use for today. So the analogous colors that I'm going to use for today's painting are yellow, blue, and green. The very first thing I'm going to do is activate my watercolors by just dipping a little bit of water into each color that I'll be using to sort of create a little puddle. The first thing we're going to do is something called a flat wash. So basically I'm going to get some paint on my brush, and I'm just going to paint a small splotch on the top corner of that color. So when I try to make this as even as I can, it's called a wash. But with watercolors, you can also paint in more of a thin line depending on the size of your brush. You'll have a thin or thick line. If I want my color to look lighter, I do that by controlling how much water I use. So for example, if I want my color to start off dark and fade to light, I can do that by adding more water as I go. So I'll start off using just my color, and as I blend down the page, I'm going to add a little bit of water to my brush. This is going to make my color lighter as I blend it downward. So you'll see it's going to go from dark to light based on how much water that I use. If I want to try to mix colors, you can see what happens when I have one color. I'll start off with my yellow on the top, and I'm going to have these colors bleed together. So watch what happens when this yellow touches this pool of blue. When the two colors meet in the middle, they're going to spread out, and you'll see now that yellow and blue are going to make green. So when two colors touch and blend, we call that a bleed. Another way that you can blend two colors is with a variegated wash. This one is similar to the graded wash, but we're going to do two different colors. So I'll start off by using my blue on top. And I'm going to blend that down, just like the bleed, with my yellow, which will then blend up into the blue. And the places that they overlap will create green. All the techniques that we've been doing so far are called wet on dry. So we have a wet paintbrush on dry paper. But next I want to see what happens in a technique called wet on wet. So if we get our paper wet first, I rinsed off my brush and I'm just using water to paint on my paper. Watch what happens when I place color onto the wet parts of my paper. You'll see that they're going to spread out, but only where the paper is already wet. This can also be a really good technique for blending colors. So if I add a little bit of green, you can see what happens when those two mix together. I'll even add a little bit of blue. So this sort of splotchy look, again, can be easily achieved with wet paper and wet paint. Another way to mix colors is something called glazing. So glazing happens when you do a thin layer of watercolor, you let it dry, and then you do a thin layer of a second color over top. So I'm going to start off, and for now I'm going to paint a bunch of little ovals using my yellow color. Once it dries, we will practice mixing colors over top to create glazing. When you use watercolor, there's not a good way really to erase your colors. Usually if you want white, you have to just leave the white of your paper. But there are a few ways around that. One of them is called lifting. So if you paint just a wash of color, and I'm mixing a green color in my lid. So if I mix yellow and blue, so I'm just making a flat wash of color. Then I'm going to use my napkin or paper towel, and I'm just going to dab off certain parts of the color. So you'll notice that if I do this before my paint dries, it does a pretty good job of lifting off and almost erasing that color. Once it's dry, I would have to re-wet it for this to work. So that technique is called lifting. Another way to kind of keep areas clean while you're painting with watercolor is called a resist. So artists use a lot of different materials to use watercolor resist. You could use masking tape, you could use paste, you could use some other sort of resist fluid, or you could use a crayon. So ideally a white crayon works best, or any light color. I'm going to use yellow. So I'm going to go ahead and just draw some little circles, and you'll see what happens when I paint over top of them with a darker color. You want to make sure you press down fairly hard. And when you paint watercolor over top, the paint is going to resist these places where the wax is. So now watch what happens when I paint over. A few other watercolor techniques for applying paint, besides just brushing it on, include a splatter or drip. So the first one we'll do is drip. And to do this, you're gonna have some color on your brush, and you're actually going to hold your paper upward and make sure you mix a lot of water with it. At this point, be careful that the rest of your page is mostly dry. and you're going to kind of drip with a big puddle on your page, and you can watch it drip downward. So using a lot of water, you might have to tap it a little bit to get it started, but once it finds a little trail, it will drip down your page. Sometimes you might have to give it a little tap to get it started. And you can even mix colors a little bit while you do a drip. So there's that. Another technique you can use is splatter. So this is very similar. You're going to get some paint on your brush, but this time when you go to tap it on your paper, you're going to get some little splatter marks. So hold your brush and then make sure you have lots of paint on it, and with one finger you'll just tap right above your paper and get some droplets. The closer you do this to your paper, the more controlled it's going to be. If you hold your brush up high, your droplets are going to go all over. The last cool effect we're going to do for now is using your table salt. So pick any color and just create a flat wash on your paper. So I think I'm going to do blue. And while your paint is still wet, you're going to sprinkle some table salt just on the wet area, and then you're going to have to wait a little bit for that to dry. So what happens when you're doing this is that as the salt dries up, it's going to pull away the water, and you'll be left with a really cool crystal effect. I can show you what it looks like in some of my previous examples. So those two are sort of the crystal effect, kind of speckled looking. So you'll have to wait until this is completely dry, and then you can just brush off the salt and you'll be left with the cool speckle effect in the end. The last thing to do is to add a second coat of color to our little yellow glazing circles. So if you remember, I told you that mixing complementary colors will create a dull color. So the opposite or complement of yellow is going to be purple. I'm going to get just a small amount on my brush and show you what it looks like when you mix yellow and purple. You want to make sure you're thinning out your colors a lot when you glaze. You don't want it to be too strong, so add a lot of water so that you can still see the color that's underneath. So here's a little bit of purple over top of the yellow. You'll see that it makes it into more of a brown color. Maybe add a little more. So with each of these circles, go ahead and try out different color mixing. So you can see what happens maybe if you just add another layer of yellow to get a really vibrant color, and just make it even darker and bolder. You could try adding another dark color, for example blue, which we know will make green. You could try mixing a green with the yellow and you'll get sort of a yellow-green. Or you could also try some warm colors. So for example, if we mix red with yellow, we will get an orange. Or if we mix orange with yellow, we'll get a lighter, more of like a golden yellow-orange. So on each of these circles, see what happens when you mix various colors. You can try doing some with more water, some with less water, and see what kind of colors you can create with glazing. So once your paint is dry and no longer looks shiny, we're going to use a Sharpie marker just to outline every single little splotch that we did and really make it pop. So the last thing I did in my example to tie it all together is connect all the different splotches with a little group of parallel lines, almost like a path or a tunnel that's running through your entire page. And you're finished. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you had fun and learned something new about watercolor. Just to recap some of the techniques that we learned, we have flat wash, graded wash, variegated wash, lifting, wet on wet, glazing, crayon resist, splatter, drip, bleed, and salt. So we would love to see what you made today. When you're finished with your project, please take a picture and tag us on Facebook or Instagram at Artmobile. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to our next class.